Good afternoon, Brian. How are you today?
So, good afternoon, Frank. I think it's 3 weeks since we talked, and since then spring has started, and the dark side of globalization has become more in evidence than it was before. It's really quite remarkable what's happened in the last 3 weeks in Afghanistan and now more recently in France.
It really it's something. It harkens back to those days in the late '60s in the United States when you had those mass shootings that would occur every so often with Richard Speck and Charles Whitman, and they seem to be very regular. And now these things are in fact happening everywhere, and they're now tinged with a little bit more than just simple, not that it's simple, but sheer simple mental instability. I mean, it's for a cause or for some sort of geopolitical reason.
I think it's a very different sort of motivation. If it's predictable at all, it has to be predicted in very different ways from the way we used to predict this sort of thing. Who would have guessed that in a place like Toulouse, in a religious school, something like this could happen? We would have expected it to happen in a global city rather than a provincial city. We wouldn't have expected it to happen in a schoolyard, but rather in a business office or something that was a larger population. After all, it was nothing like the World Trade Center. It was just a very few people. Terrible for those few people, but not terrorism as we've come to think of it.
It was interesting too because it was spread out. Those two separate incidents, separated by I believe 4 different days. So the first one was the killing of the 3 French parachutists and severely wounding a 4th who remains in a coma, and then of course the shooting at the synagogue school the other day, which. It's amazing because you see these guys and you wonder if bin Laden was still alive, if he would be smugly nodding saying, yes, it's true, I've franchised this concept, this idea out, it can never be killed.
And then I think we have to compare what has happened in France with what's happened in Afghanistan. Because in Afghanistan, I forget now whether the incineration of the Qurans had happened before or after we last talked.
Before.
And since then, the shooting outside the village of Pajwai was presumably not predictable in any way at all, but has had consequences in Afghanistan, which are comparable to the consequences that the shootings in France have had in France and probably in Europe as a whole, although it's perhaps too soon to say that. In each case, I think that it not only shows that security is a very different sort of problem in a globalizing world, but also that it's not going to be possible according to the institutions that we currently have, either national or transnational, to prevent this sort of thing from happening, or to predict it happening where it does happen.
Well, I would agree with that, and I guess how I'm looking at it is a little bit different in some respects. I think people are always capable of outrageously violent actions. Now, the question now is whether or not the embracing of semi-institutional reasons, whether it be the fellow in Afghanistan who was obviously on his 4th tour and had part of his foot blown away, was undergoing personal financial bankruptcy procedures. His house was being foreclosed upon. He had 2 days earlier been standing next to a soldier who had had both of his legs blown off. I mean, you add all of these things up, and people do these awful things, and also the fellow in Toulouse. And but for the fact that all of these things had happened, the 4 tours of duty and or the Islamic extremism, the question is, would either of those two men have been motivated to do the same thing? And I don't know the answer to that, but I sort of think that maybe they would have. I mean, there's a certain human condition that possibly acts anyway, and then I don't want to be as naive as to suggest that these things are excuses that they're embracing in order to justify or warrant their actions, but at least to a layperson, some of it smacks of that.
Well, I would say that in the case of both of these cases, the staff sergeant in Afghanistan and the how should I characterize him? The person of Algerian descent who was alienated from the society around him in France. There were things going on in their own personal lives that conditioned them for this sort of behavior. However, one assumes, I think it's fairly obvious in the case of the staff sergeant in Afghanistan, and I think it's likely to have been the case in France as well, that what caused the actual event to happen, where and when it happened, was to do with the succession of events. That is, people found themselves in a particular situation at a particular time that led them to react in this way. So the person in France had been looking for opportunities to do something for Al-Qaeda, and had been developing a supply base to enable him to do it. But it's difficult to believe that his final objective was to shoot a few students in a Jewish religious school.
Right.
The fact that he did it there was presumably the product of things that had actually happened in a succession of unpredictable incidents in the time leading up to it. I think that's the condition of our globalizing world that makes things so unpredictable compared to the way they were in the past.
So it's the rapidity of the input, if you will, into the human awareness framework.
There's so much going on for all of us. We have the opportunity to react to so many things in a normal day. Most of us are fairly well conditioned to events around us and just make our way through them. But there are people who, for one reason or another, are out of tune with what's going on around them, and sooner or later do something of this nature. But you can't predict, you can't know what's going on in their minds to begin with, to predict from that point of view, although the person in France had been followed by the police for some time, but hadn't done anything that led them to bring him in. But then something must have happened in the last few days that led him to do this, which presumably was nothing like the sort of harm he would like to have caused given his training.
You know, you're right, because certainly with the staff sergeant in Afghanistan, if this had been post-World War II, I mean, news from home would be arriving courtesy of letters. Now, of course, I presume that he was in constant Skype contact, much as we are now, with his wife and people at home, and was getting real-time information as to the increasing slide in his financial and emotional fortunes. And I mean, you walk out of a Quonset hut at 2 o'clock in the morning after having had a tearful discussion with your wife that your house is being repossessed. I mean, I'm sure we're going to begin to see some of these details leaked, certainly at his trial. But it's too much. It's too much information. It's too much to absorb. And if you're emotionally fragile because of conditions, in this case 4 tours in Afghanistan, God knows what can happen.
And the way we're going to deal with it now is as separate cases. because one is going to be taken care of in one justice system and the other is going to be taken care of in another justice system. And we have no institutional framework for learning from the comparison of the two cases. That's something you can only do in academia.
No, that's true. And unfortunately, in both cases, I mean, the French case is now, there's not going to be much of a case because the man is dead, of course, but the French instance is in the middle of the French electoral campaign. And the American and the staff sergeant's case, it's now combined into the geopolitical maneuvering between Karzai and Obama.
Yeah. Well, certainly, whatever happens, it's going to. It may even turn out to be a cusp, which, so that although the situation has been deteriorating for some time, for the U.S. Presence on the ground in Afghanistan, and also the relationship between the governments, nevertheless, a qualitative difference. Excuse me. Now will now become more obvious because of this event. But what I have in mind is the fact that if enough of these events like this, incidents like this, get attention that is more than just local, then it's not going to be an effect just for the US and Afghanistan, or even the US globally. It's going to be an event for that produces a qualitative change in the way people think about the world generally. So we don't know if something like this happened in China, we probably wouldn't hear about it, or it would be a minor paragraph in our news. Same in India or even in Russia. But now if something comes up in the next few days, we're going to relate it to these incidents.
Right. Well, even if you try to tag it back to the killings in Norway last summer.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah.
So if too many of these things happen together, so they're all in the heads of a significant number of people all over the world at the same time, then there's going to be a change in global opinion about the way the world is working. And it's going to be interesting to see what that generates. But it could be a new sort of leadership, new sort of ideas about how to deal with these things. Because at the moment, we have no idea about how to deal with these things except on a purely national level.
I know that you're trained to look at humanity and its history in an almost geologic sense, in your geologic sense of time. And I agree with you. That's the only way you can do it. But I get so darned impatient right now because what more needs to happen to get the attention of the collective wisdom to try to get people to stand up and say, well, wait a minute, forget about the national boundaries here for a minute. I mean, there's a much bigger process going on.
I would say that the answer to that's an extremely important question, and I think the answer to it is that not enough things have happened in different parts of the world close enough to each other for people who see the world in global terms because of the amount they travel to take it in. And our level of global awareness has not risen yet to the point where this sort of event will have this sort of meaning for us. But we're probably getting close to it.
Well, I would say then that this is a pretty, in one respect, dismal outlook then, because we're dealing with this inexorable process of globalization. I mean, the horse is way out of the barn door here. And for it to be dealt with properly and channeled properly, it's going to require a collective awareness and subsequent decision set, which is not going to happen until more bad things happen.
That's, I'm afraid, absolutely true. And it's going to be the interplay between the bad things on the dark side of globalization and the good things that provide positive possibilities on the lighter side, the combination of the two that's going to make something new possible. And I'm sure you've been following Kofi Annan and the reaction of the United Nations and the fact that now they produced a non-binding resolution which won't really achieve anything. Well, what it's achieved is that it's achieved agreement on the part of everybody about how to do almost nothing at all.
That's a pretty low standard to reach. Yeah.
But nevertheless, it's generally seen as a step in the right direction. But it's not qualitatively new. That's the problem. And I'm afraid I'm going to say that I don't think that the United Nations is structurally capable of producing a decision that is qualitatively new.
No, I concur with you there.
And so it's got to be something that is new from a structural point of view, and we don't yet know how that's going to be generated. But,
let me ask you this before we stop. There's been a phenomenon that video about the warlord in Uganda that has spread throughout the world since we last spoke. I mean, what do you make of that? I mean, that's something that certainly couldn't have happened 10 years ago.
I don't know. But that the Lord's Resistance Army is amazingly successful, and I mean, it's difficult to understand why it should be still gathering strength, but it seems to be.
It seems to be, yeah. Interesting. This is a fellow who no one had even heard of 3 weeks ago, very few people anyway, and now the video is being shown in schools, and kids around the world are aware of who he is.
Yeah.
He must feel as if like the sun and the stars and the moon have fallen on him. It's like, oh my God. So,
but it's very likely that the qualitatively new move that that I think we need in order to change the way things are moving is likely to come out of somewhere like Central Africa or China or India rather than the West, simply because of the rate of change and the degree of disruption of normal processes there.
I agree.
That's probably a place to stop for this week.
It is. All right. Well, Professor, thank you very much. All right.